If you're building the web application and you're already done with the login and register functionalities in your system, you have the authentication in place, for instance with the JWT and the refresh tokens, then the next step will be to implement the external provider authentication such as Google. My name is Remik, and in today's tutorial I'll give you the step-by-step process how to implement Google authentication in your .NET Web API, which could be very problematic based on the documentation, and also how to integrate it with the front-end application such as React app. If you haven't subscribed my channel yet, then I highly recommend to smash the subscribe button down below to support me on the Patreon. The link is down below in the description, to write the comment, to give me a like, and now let's get started. Now, very short disclaimer, this video is based on the full authentication course using JSON Web Tokens and refresh tokens that is available on my YouTube channel. So if you haven't watched this video and you would like to be on the same page with me, then click on the right top corner where the video is now displayed. And now we can go into the google.com, and based on this code that is provided on my GitHub, we can enable the Google authentication in ASP.NET Core app and then integrate together with the React application on the front-end side. The first step will be to click on the link that is down below in the description to be able to open these APIs and services in the Google Cloud. You need to have, of course, the Google account for that, and once you're on this page, you can select the project and select an existing one if you have, of course, one already created, or just to create the new project as I will be doing it, of course, over there. So I'll just type the project name, Google Auth example, and then I'll click on create. Once the project has been created, we can click on this OAuth consent screen tab and click on the get started. Now we have to provide the application name, so I'll write Google Auth example application and my Gmail associated with my Google account, and I will click next. Now we're going to select external for the audience to available to test any user, but it will be in the testing mode and will only be available for now to test the users that you add to the list of the test users. I'm going to click next, contact information. So I'm just going to type as well auth tutorial 2123. So my Gmail, and I'll click on finish. Now you have to click on this create OAuth client button, and the application type in my case will be the web application, and I will change the default name of the client to the Google Auth example app client. And now the most important part will be to set up properly the JavaScript authorized origin and also the redirect URIs. At first, the authorized JavaScript origin will be your front-end application. So in my case, when we'll be creating just in a while the React application, it will be the local host with the default port 5173, because we'll use Vite to create the React application. So this will be the URL of your frontend that will be calling the ASP.NET Core Web API. And now the authorized redirect URIs will be your application URL. So in the launch settings.json file, you will have for sure some port with the local host. So you have to copy this value. In my case, it will be the following URI. And now the very important part will be something that is hidden for us, that will be done internally once we'll configure the Google authentication in our web API. It will be this URL, so sign in dash Google. So now there are many misconceptions on the web that you have to create the callback function for the Google to be able to call your API once again once the user is authorized. No, you have to not create this kind of endpoint, but it will be done under the hood. So you have to type your basic URL for your ASP.NET Core application with the /sign-in Google, and the callback function that will be called will be done something as it will be not the same one. So I had a lot of problems with this. So just short reminder, it will be this URL that will be called by the Google itself once the user is authenticated, and the callback function is something else than that. Also make sure that it will be written as follows, so sign in -Google, because if you have something else in here, then probably you'll receive the invalid redirect URI once you'll be dealing with the Google authentication. So this is the very common problem as well. So just to have typo in this place. And so once we have everything, we can click on the create, and we see that we have the client ID for our application in here and also the client secret. So those two values will be required for us to establish the Google authentication in the ASP.NET Core application, and also the client ID will be needed in the React frontend application. And now the last thing to do, we need to add the test user in the audience tab, because for now the application is in the testing publishing status. So after you publish your application, then of course you will be able to log with whatever user that you would like to from Google, but for now it's the testing mode, so we need to add the test user. So now I'm just gonna type auth tutorial to my test user, and we'll click save. So now we have to store those two values somewhere. So in order to do that, the most recommended way is to create the user secrets manager. So in here, in the API directory, we have to type .NET user secrets in it to initialize the store. Now, once we have our user secrets store created, we can go into the documentation from Microsoft how to set up Google authentication in the ASP.NET Core project, and we have those two commands over there to set the client ID based on the value that you have in your Google Cloud, and also the client secret. So I will use this one. And now we have to remove this placeholder and get the client ID from Google. So now here we have the value for the client ID. I will copy this out and I will paste in here between those parentheses. And when we will click enter, we see that we successfully saved this secret to the store. And now we have to do the same for the client secret. And now I will copy this command. And we have to do the same. So we have to remove the placeholder for the client secret. And we have to copy this value. Copy client secret. And we have to paste the value over there. And now in the API project, we have to install one Nugget package. It will be called Microsoft.ASP.NET Core Authentication.Google. So I'll select this one and install it over there. And now to set up properly the Google authentication in our API, we need to use add cookie method before the add JWT barrier. And after that, we need to add also add Google method with some options. So inside of it, we'll use the options. And at first, we need to assign the two variables, so the client ID and the client secret that we set in our user store. So now I'll just type var client ID is equal to the builder.configuration with the following key. So it will be authentication Google client ID. Next one will be the client secret. So it will be similar. client secret, and it will be the client secret. And now we can validate it if it's present or not. So if client ID is equal to null, then we'll throw new argument null exception, name of client ID, and the same will be done for the client secret. And now, once we know that we have the client secret and the client ID, we can assign those values to our options of the Google authentication. So it will be options.client ID will be equal to the client ID, and options.client secret, of course, will be equal to the client secret. And after that, once we have our default sign-in scheme equal to the JWT bearer defaults.authentication scheme, we need to, of course, assign it over there. So sign-in scheme will be the different one, and it will be the cookie authentication defaults.authentication scheme. We have to overwrite this value in order to enable our Google authentication as well. And now we have to create two endpoints in order to properly allow the users to log in with the Google in our .NET Web API. So now the first one will be called app map get, and it will be with the following root. So API account login Google. And the second one will be called API account login Google and callback. So now the case is that this endpoint will be invoked from our frontend application, so React in my case. And once the user will be properly authenticated on the Google site, it will be redirected to this endpoint. And here we can check if we have already the user with the same email in our database. If not, then we can create the user for this email with the blank password. So it will mean that this user was logged in with the Google, and of course later on he can change this password when we have this kind of the functionality in our system. But for now, we're just gonna only take care of this flow. So at first, this endpoint will be called, then it will be redirected to the Google. Then we are setting also the redirect URI to this endpoint. And after this one will be completed, then we need to redirect, of course, back to the frontend application. Now we need to think what will be passed from our frontend application, and it will be the return URL that will be invoked in the second endpoint to go back to our React application after the whole login flow. So we need to write from query attribute, and then it will be the string return URL. Now we need to get the link generator, After that, we need a sign-in manager with the type of your user entity. Sign manager, and the last one will be the HTTP context called context. And now we need to create the authentication properties based on the Google provider. That will be the most important part in the whole flow, because if you will not set this properly over there, then you will lead to a lot of problems such as invalid redirect URL or maybe this login callback will not be even invoked because I had this problem before that I was assigning this redirect URL in here not to this endpoint, but I was assigning it to this /sign in Google endpoint that is present in the Google Cloud. So it's totally invalid. So in this case, we need to set those as follows. Var properties is equal to the sign-in manager, configure external authentication properties. We have to pass the provider as Google, and now we have to create the redirect URL. So we need to take the link generator, get path by name, and we have to pass the HTTP context, then the endpoint name. So I'm just gonna assign with name Google login callback. So it will be this endpoint name. And after that, we need to attach as the query parameter return URL that will be passed from our return URL from the front-end side. So now it will create this whole URL, so it will be redirected at first to this endpoint, but it will consist also of this return URL from the front-end side. So it's the most important part to have your redirect URL set as follows. So just to point to this endpoint, for instance, with the name as the login with Google callback, and then to not lose the information about the initial return URL to the front-end application. And now we need to return results.challenge, and we need to pass the authentication properties to it, and then the authentication schemes, so it will be Google in this case. And now the very short overview, what is done under the hood. So this results.challenge method, once it's invoked, it tells the authentication middleware to start the external login flow using the specified authentication scheme. In this case, we have Google. So it triggers the middleware to redirect the user to Google's OAuth 2.0 login page. After the user will be logged in on the Google site, he will be redirected to this endpoint. So that's why it's very important to configure properly this redirect URL to point into this endpoint. In here, just in a while, we'll create the logic to check the claims from the response from the Google, and then to create the account in our system when the user is not available in our database. And now, as before, we need to pass the parameters to our endpoint. So at first it will be the same. So the return URL to our frontend application. We need also the HTTP context called context. And also we need the account service in my case to be able to create the user in our database based on the result from Google, and also to return the JSON web token and the refresh token to our frontend application. So now we'll have the var result will be equal to the await context dot authenticate async, and we need to pass the Google defaults dot authentication scheme. And based on that, of course, we need to make this call async. Once we have this result, we can check if the result was successful or not. So if succeeded, and of course, if it was not successful, then we need to return results unauthorized. And once we know that the user was properly authenticated on the Google site, then we know that we can create the account for this user if already it does not exist in our database, and then redirect the user back to the frontend application with the JSON Web Token and the refresh token. So now I need to create the method in our iAccount service to handle this Google login process. So now I will create the method in my iAccount service that will be called login with Google Async. And we'll have the claims principal. Now we need to implement this method. So of course, implement missing members. It will be done as the async method. And now we can invoke this method from our endpoint. So it will be await account service dot login with Google Async, and we can pass the result dot principal. And after that, we need to return results dot redirect and this return URL. So when this results.redirect method will be called, then the user will be redirected back to the frontend application, so to this return URL that we passed initially from our login Google endpoint. And now we'll implement the logic for checking if the user exists in our database based on the claims principle. If yes, then to only return as the cookie JSON Web Token and refresh token. If the user does not exist in our system, then we need to create one. So we'll create the user entity, enter the database, and then, of course, as before, return JSON Web Token and the refresh token. Now I'll create the exception that would be related to the external login provider. So external login provider exception.cs, and as an argument, it will be the string provider and string message. So it will inherit from the exception class, and we'll type external login provider. We will pass the provider. Error occurred, and we'll pass the message. And we need to remove those as well. So we'll have the external login provider exception. We'll pass the provider. So external login provider error occurred with this following error message. So of course you can create the enum for this provider, such as Google, Facebook, Apple ID, or whatever that you will be using. So, but in this case, I'll leave this as a string, and going back to the login with Google Async method, I will just type var email is equal to the claims principal dot find first value, and it will be claim types dot email. Before that, we'll also check if the claims principal is equal to null. If yes, then we'll throw new external login provider exception. It will be the Google, and as the message, it will be claims. Claims principal is null. If the email is null, then of course it will be if email is equal to null. Then also throw the exception. Email is null. Now we can take the user from our database. So we'll use the await user manager dot find by email async. Once we know that the email is not null. And now we can check if the user is equal to null. If yes, that means that we don't have this user with associated email from the claims principal in our database. So we can create this user. So var new user is equal to the new user. And inside of it, we need to pass username because it's required in the identity. So we need to pass the email. The email will be the same as the email. So because we need those two values to be present, first name will be equal to the claims principal dot find first value, and the claim types will be the given name. If it's null, then I will assign this as the string dot empty. Last name will be the claims principal, find first value, and the claim types will be the surname. And after that, we'll use string dot empty. And once we have the already existing and authenticated properly in Google user, that means that the email has been properly confirmed. And now we can type var result is equal to the await user manager create async, and we can pass this new user as parameter. And then we can check if the result succeeded, but will have the opposite value. So when it was not successful, then we'll throw new external login provider exception. It will be the Google. And after that, we'll pass the message that unable to create user, and we'll take string dot join. That will be comma separated, and we'll take the result dot errors dot select, and we'll take the descriptions. And now we need to assign the user that will be equal to this new user. And now outside of this if statement, we need to also add to our database the information about the user that he was logged in using this external provider, so Google, and also the provider key in this case will be something unique related to our user, so it will be the email itself. And now we have to add this information to the database. So var login result is equal to the await user manager dot add login async, and we have to pass the user and also the info. And now, of course, if it was not successful, then we'll throw the exception, external login provider exception, enabled to login the user with those errors. Yes, so if login result dot succeeded is the opposite value, so it's false, then we'll throw this following error. And now the last piece will be to return to the user JSON web token and refresh token. So just for the simplicity of this tutorial, I will just copy and paste those values that we had in our previous video. So we'll generate the JSON web token, refresh token assigned to the user, then add to the database and write as the HTTP only cookies those two values, so access token and refresh token. Now, once we have everything set up properly on our backend side, so on our ASP.NET Core Web API side, we can create very simple React application with the usage of this npm create vid latest command, and then we'll create the button that once it will be clicked, then it will invoke our endpoints associated with the login functionality, and then it will go back to our React application and we will see if the user was properly authenticated using Google as the external provider. So now I will click npm create vid with the AT sign latest, and the project name will be authentication.ui. Package name will be the same, and we'll choose the React with the TypeScript and speedy web compiler. Now we have to go inside of our UI, and then we have to type npm install. Now I will go back to our API to check what endpoint we need to invoke from our React site in order to be able to log in with Google. So we have the map get endpoint, and we have also this root and the return URL that will be passed from the React application to return back with this redirect method to our React application. So now in the app tsx file, I will remove almost the whole content of it, and I will create one button that will invoke this get endpoint. So it will be button with on click. It will invoke the handle login with Google method, and we need to create this method. So it will be const handle login with Google, and inside of it we'll invoke window dot location dot href. Now we need to assign the name for this button in order to be able to see that in our frontend. So it will be sign in with Google. And now we have to fill in the last part in our implementation, so the URL for the get endpoint in our API. So in the launch settings.json file in our API, we have this following base URL for our application. So it will be the first part of this URL. The second one will be this get endpoint root. So it will be this one. We need to invoke this get endpoint from our React site. So I will paste it in here. And as we see, we have the return URL back to our React application. So we need to assign the return URL to the HTTP local host 5173. So the default port of the vid application. And once we will be enabling the communication between the frontend and the backend, we need, of course, the course policy in our API. So it will be builder.services at course. And inside of it, we'll have the options. So it will be the add policy with the name course policy. And we'll have also the options for this course policy, and we need to add options dot allow any header, allow any method, and it will be with origins, and the origin will be HTTP local host 5173, so our React application. Also, we need to add allow credentials in order to make it work also with our login and register endpoints. So now we need to assign after the builder.build method this course policy. So it will be app use course, and we have to take the same, exactly the same name as it was assigned here. So this course policy. Now, once we have everything properly implemented, we can test our solution. So I will click on this sign in with Google button. We see that this login Google endpoint was invoked. We have the return URL. So the URL back to our React application. And then once we click on this resume, this results.challenge will redirect to the Google OAuth 2.0 to be able to let our user to log in with Google. And then after the whole process, it will call this endpoint. So this endpoint will be called basically from the Google side. We see that now we have the URL from the google.com. We have the sign in with Google, and to be able to continue, you have to type your email and also password. So also we have the indication that this application that you will be authenticating with Google will be called Google Auth Example App. So I'll just use my example user. I'll enter the password. And when we click next, we see the information to sign into Google Auth Example App. And when we click on continue, we see that this endpoint was properly called from the Google site. So now we see that it was successful, so we don't have unauthorized response, and we can process further with this login with Google Async method in our account service. We see that the email was not null, and also we had the claims principal present. So now we see that we don't have this user in our database. So this user will be created and will be assigned to this user that was null previously. And now we see that this info was also created. We have the login result and it was succeeded. So now the last part will be to create the JSON Web Token, refresh token assigned to this brandly new created user, and then to add the HTTP only cookies as the access token and refresh token. And the last step in our flow will be to redirect the user back to the React frontend application. So when I click resume, we'll be back in our frontend with the HTTP only cookies as the JSON Web Token and the refresh token. And in the cookies of the browser, we see that access token and refresh token were properly created and passed as the HTTP only cookies to our frontend. And from the database point of view, we see that this Google Auth tutorial user was created in our database. We have the refresh token assigned to him, and also the username and the email is the same as we provided during the login process, and the password hash is null, of course, because we were not assigning any password to this user because it was login with Google, so as external provider. If this video was helpful for you, then I highly recommend to smash the subscribe button down below, to write the comment, to give me like, to reach the more audience with this content. And you can also support me on the Patreon. The link is down below in the description, and see you in the next one.